Good morning, everybody. For those of you who were here at our first workshop, just to let everybody else know who's new, this is our second of three workshops in regarding to data sovereignty, hosted by GNU and partnered with the DFO. We are going to start the same way we did last time. We're going to start with an opening prayer. We'll go through some introductions, some general housekeeping again, and we will jump right into presentations. Some of the presentations, for those of you who were here last time, we did kind of give you a preamble on what was coming. So we're going to go through just the agenda really quick before I ask Roseanne to come up and give us an opening prayer. So we'll be talking about CARE and OCAP. GNU will be giving examples of where CARE and OCAP wasn't applied and how it created complications, so on and so forth, and how CAP and OCAP could, CARE and OCAP can help support things moving forward. There'll be general discussions that'll take place. There'll be focus group questions, time and opportunity for everybody here on location and online as well to engage and ask questions and present some stuff. Multiple presentations from GNU along with members of DFO. So without moving too further into it, let's welcome Roseanne Martin for our opening prayer.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roseanne Martin here from Gespe'gewa'gi, Quebec. I am very honored to be able to do your opening ceremony today. I'm a little under the weather, and I have my own personal reasons, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to light up the sweetgrass this morning. Because sweetgrass for me is a kindness medicine. And believe you me, after what I've been through this morning, I need it. I need that strength to get through the day. Kisul looked in this coming delivery rose and let's go watch. Naman way na music is kada kwacha ba kisus. Well, all in this coming up, me majuwakan, well, all in dandeli and quavin, dandeli bokon win, dandel gekanamu. Atani gala, me majuinu, there's a discussion in Tautian. Pakais need Delaware, a big stick to it, need to wear with you, down there's a need be mad one. Ajical with us, down going when chica sky with Nigagisco. Had a walked away, you should know you can already want to go into the walk on the house walk and a bon medium. A kid on Nigagisco and in Gizzy I do not to call away. I was by a book on New York. We go on not Nigagisco. Musigus, now who said, Glow watching the commission and the kun said, well, I'll have children now, we gave me a capitic now, kill of Nigagisco. Long should not. Kitchen and Magamiko make a damagis with Andesiki and Cordoban, while all in the some one don't get a make in prison, while all in the major of chip cheese of Reese's cheese. I will all in shouldn't prisoners, and there's what you got dodge in the Gagis cook like that. Will all you shouldn't know. Kit Pukchi Chakamis of Chiben of Wiggle up the Gagis cook to win, which it way we act. Maui Danish the Gagis cook. I got no man is strong girl. Will all you shouldn't know. Sabi every day bit of Kudesnu, every day we exchange Chakamis. Keep them copy not the other order and a garden of Chidabiji. Well, that's all not. Dan there's your bay dial. Well, let me get cook. I book on my daughter. Well, I'll shouldn't. After wake me not because no, Gina makes you Jacamish. Give them COVID Nadia on the Jordan and a car and do chicken amino. Chichinamo. Well, that's in the gay cook. They won't not bay dial. Let it. Well, I'll shouldn't. Why bake me no what to commit kinak them for your Nadia. The Jordan on the car and to Giziku me much you know what Giziku is. Now we go moon not the school. Mau look good niche, Maui darnish. Maui also the manage. I sunk away, head level to Disney, Yagi school, launch it. Tandays of your normal. So basically, what I always pray for is that 7-directional prayer for guidance, for strength to keep on going each and every day. I went through a pretty hard time early this morning, and I have to ask for help on a daily basis. I have to smudge sometimes several times a day to get that life balance. When my mind decides to go on the left side and that old rose comes out, we don't want that. So this morning I prayed for healing, actually, in our communities, because every one of us are going through our own personal struggles, whether we have to admit it or not. So every now and then I have to remind people, get back to your ways, get back to our cultural ways, you know, to go on. I asked this, the sky world, grandfather, son, star nations, grandmother moon, our mother the earth, that sacred water that she provides for each and every one of us. For the wood, for the grandfathers, for the meals, for the little ones that are doing the medicine searches and all that. I asked them to work together. I opened that eastern door to let that grandfather eagle come in. Sits in that direction there as a protector for our children and all that. So I asked that they bring some good medicine for us. I asked the grandmother that sits in the southern door, that is a protector for all our sisters and all that is female, to come with us, join us today. I asked the grandfather bear that sits in the west for his strength, because there are days that each and every one of us go through hard times. So I asked that bear for that healing. I asked the white bear of the north to come and join us there for the elders and all that, and bring language, culture, spirituality, open those doors so that we can talk gently and all that. So all in all, thank you for allowing us here today. Mr. Norma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roseanne. So, moving forward, again, just some general housekeeping for those of you who are unaware. Bathrooms are located in the back, exits to the left and the right here. There is coffee and donuts, muffins, and some fruit available for those who would like some. We are going to move forward with our agenda, and it is going to be Mr. Lee Croft giving us a recap of what was discussed and the interpretation of what was discussed to make sure that what was discussed and heard was properly heard, and it was something that they are working very, very hard to make sure that they get accurate. So I will ask Mr. Lee Croft to come up and give his presentation. As he's coming, I would encourage individuals online as well. Should you have any questions, there is a moderator available to you, and they will make sure that your questions get asked.
Great, thank you, Mickey. So very grateful to be able to join here again for the second workshop in the series in Gespe'gewa'gi in the Gespe'gewa'gi district of Mi'kmaq territory. Just to sort of reintroduce myself, and for people who weren't here at the first workshop, introduce myself to you. My name is Lee Croft. I live in Ottawa in Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. I work as a policy advisor in the Office of the Chief Data Steward for Fisheries and Oceans Canada, or DFO. So we've been very fortunate to be able to work together with Ginu and everyone in these workshops. What I'd like to do right now is just briefly go over some of what we heard from the first workshop, since an important part of this is having this platform to have discussions around Indigenous data sovereignty and to learn from what people have to share. So we want to make sure that we are properly listening to and understanding what's being communicated, and take this chance to convey a little bit of what we've understood and verify things with people. There will also be more detailed summary materials being sent out, so everyone will be able to have a look at that and review and provide any feedback on it as well. But for now, I just want to touch on some of the core points of what we had heard. How are you advancing the slides? Oh, never mind, I got it. Okay, so starting out with the first engagement question, we were asking about where there is a need for the Government of Canada and for DFO to improve data management practices around relationships with Indigenous communities. So one of the key things that we heard here was that there's a need for Indigenous peoples to have equal roles and positions across all aspects of management and use of Indigenous data. Currently, that equality of positions is not something that exists. There's oftentimes views of Indigenous peoples as having a role as a helper or participant, rather than having proper recognition and attribution for contributions that are made. So this needs to change to ensure that there is equal positions as partners and as collaborators. And one thing that, or rather, so that spans across all aspects of use and management of data, whether it's the collection of data, the publication of data, decision making around the sharing of that data and how it's going to be used, looking at uses for research, for data analysis. So it really spans across all of that. And then another point that was very relevant to this is also looking at ensuring that there is equal value in indigenous methods when looking at those in relation to Western methods for research and for data analysis and for decision making. So again, there's really this imbalance here in the sense that there's sort of a perceived hierarchy of Western methods having maybe a greater importance than indigenous methods when it comes to looking at any kind of research, any kind of decision making. So there are different ways that this plays out. This can be in the sense of qualitative data being given more value than, quantitative data being given more value than qualitative data, or more value than information that comes from experiences, and also knowledge that comes through stories and through experiences not being given an appropriate place alongside the data that's used for research and that's used for analysis. So there's really a need to address that type of an imbalance, finding the appropriate way to balance indigenous methods and Western methods and different sources of information coming together as well. And one way to approach that would be to do this through two-eyed seeing. The second engagement question was on looking at different views and interpretations around Indigenous data and Indigenous data sovereignty. And one thing that I found that was very clear that came out of this was just how vast the concept of Indigenous data can be, in the sense that this can really be seen as anything that pertains to data from or about Indigenous peoples. So this could be data that is collected or generated by Indigenous peoples, data about communities, about territories, about all things within them, about histories and rights and culture and customs, and much more than that as well. So it's something that has this very vast sort of area that it encompasses. And something that I think was very interesting in the discussion as well was the relationship between Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge. So looking at how Indigenous knowledge is something that is much broader than what you have just through data. And one of the really key components of that is how it also incorporates experiences that are informing what's understood through knowledge as well. So some of what we understood from this was that Indigenous knowledge is something that's built up over generations of experiences, generations of observations, something that is passed down from elders and passed down through stories, and something that is very important for decision making as well, in terms of the wisdom and the information that comes from that knowledge. And then going from those really foundational interpretations and understandings, what we heard around Indigenous data sovereignty was that this can be seen as an ability for Indigenous peoples to control their data and to participate in any processes that are making use of that data. So this could pertain to using data for nation building, to govern, for decision making, but also to provide interpretations around the data and to have those interpretations being valued by the Government of Canada. So those are some of the core things that we had heard, but again, there will be a summary going out with more detail and more information in it. So that will be another way through which we'll provide that information so that people can verify and provide feedback on it. There's one other thing that I want to follow up on from the first workshop. How are we on time, Mikey? Are we okay? Okay. So one of the questions that came up in the first workshop was for more information around exemptions to the Access to Information Act. So I explained a little bit about this in terms of how this is something that presents a really big challenge in respecting Indigenous data sovereignty, because for government departments, so for DFO, when we have Indigenous data that the department is using, there can be requests that come in from other parties to get access to that data. So they can put in a request through the Access to Information Act. And as long as certain conditions are met, we have an obligation to release that data. but that may go against the wishes of the Indigenous organization or community or government that provided that data in the first place. So it may not be something that should be shared out with other parties, but we have the obligation to do this. So I got a little bit more information about exemptions to the Access to Information Act, since this was one of the topics that had come up in some of the questions. And I have on the following slide here, I'll pull that up in a moment. There's a whole bunch of links that I've put in so that people can follow those to get a lot more detail on this. So the slides will be shared out. I'm just going to fairly quickly go over these exemptions here, but there is a lot more detail available on it as well. So there are three main ones that I wanted to go over. The first is Section 13, subsection 1 of the Access to Information Act. I had talked about this one last time. This is where there are exemptions for information that's provided by an Aboriginal government recognized under the Access to Information Act. So this, unfortunately, is a fairly small list of what governments are actually recognized. So the challenge with this one is that it won't actually be able to be put into practice most of the time, just because that list of recognized governments is so small. But the second exemption, I think, is one that is a lot more broadly applicable. So this is under Section 20, subsection 1 of the Act. And this provides exemptions for third-party information that is provided in confidence. So there's different categories for the third-party information that's considered here. This could be trade secrets, commercial, financial, scientific, technical information, as long as it is being treated as confidential. So if it can be shown to fall into one of these categories, and if it's shown that it is treated consistently in a confidential manner, then it can also have exemptions from release through the Access to Information Act. So there are some conditions that have to be met, but I think this one could be pretty useful in terms of there's probably a lot that could fall under it. And then the last one is Section 24, subsection 1 in the Act, and this one's on statutory prohibitions. What this really boils down to is that other acts can also provide exemptions to information being released. And what would be most relevant here is the Fisheries Act, Section 61, subsection 2.1, where if Indigenous knowledge is provided under that act, that can have an exemption to being released through the Access to Information Act. Now, one thing that's not fully clear to me on that one is what under the Fisheries Act actually is considered as Indigenous knowledge. So I don't think the determination there of how that's sort of how they determine what they do consider to be Indigenous knowledge or not, I don't think that part is entirely clear right now. But that is an area where we can try and get more information as well if people are interested in that. So there's a whole bunch of links here that you can follow to get different resources about each one of these. Some of them are a plain language guide, which is nice to get kind of an initial understanding of it. And then some of these have more detailed information about how and when they can be applied. And if anyone is interested in discussing those in terms of specific contexts for information that you're looking at, I'm also happy to have those discussions. So we have our team email address on here that you can reach us through. So if people do want to discuss any of that further, definitely feel free to reach out to us. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to learning more from the discussions today. And I don't know, Mikey, if you want to take a chance here, just if anyone has feedback about kind of what we had heard or. Okay. Yeah, so if anyone has either questions about what I've gone over or any corrections that you'd like to make to what we have understood from the first workshop, happy to have those discussions right now.
So, hi, I'm Sky Metallic. I'm and it I wasn't at the first one, but this is kind of bringing up a lot of real life kind of issues that we got going on right now, right? As you know, the RPPSG is the kind of like a society of fishermen out on the Gaspe coast, and they're taking us to court pretty much, saying that Canada has no right to sign any type of agreements with First Nations, specifically us, Gespe'gewa'gi. We do have a rights recognition agreement signed with Canada, and they're taking us to court saying that Canada has no right to sign that. And, it goes on and on and on. You're talking about, and what I'm hearing lately from our fisheries department is that there's issues with the DFO wanting to share our data with these third-party organizations like the RPPSG. And it's pretty concerning, and that the Freedom of Information Act or something like that seems to be more of a threat to us more than anything else. So I don't know, it's not really a question, but just kind of a comment, and just kind of let folks in the room know kind of like this is pretty serious stuff, and it's we're dealing with this on a daily basis.
Hearing in terms of this is such a challenging thing for a lot of people. This type of information for various reasons, you don't want it shared out because it can be misused and then used against you in ways that really isn't right. So I think trying to find these ways to either leverage some of these exemptions that exist, or just understanding what are the problems that are here so that we can continue to work towards finding solutions to that is really important. So one of the things that I had talked a little bit about at the first workshop is that there is also a modernization underway for the Access to Information Act, where there will be updates to it. For instance, I think one of the things they're trying to do is to expand that list of recognized governments so that that can be more applicable for people to be able to say, we have provided this information for providing it in confidence, therefore you should not be sharing it out with other parties. Excuse me. So that's hopefully something that will be changing, but I think that's going to be quite a slow change to see it actually come into practice. So I think it's important to be trying to find right now what are the solutions that he approach, either through exemptions or maybe through trying to put in these data sharing agreements that can put certain restrictions around how data is being used, or at least try to reach common understandings around how it's appropriate to use data. But definitely it's a huge problem. I don't think there's immediate solutions that can fix everything. So it's important to have these discussions and just try and understand what problems are being faced and just thinking about ways to navigate this. Thank you for sharing that. Anything else anyone would like to add or to share around this?
I guess there's just one thing I would like to add is that in the beginning, Indigenous data was sort of defined as data that's collected by Indigenous people. But I would like to also add that data that's collected by anybody on traditional territory should be considered Indigenous data, even if it's non-Indigenous people collecting the data. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add that.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely any, not necessarily just collected on Indigenous territories. It's maybe collected outside of Indigenous territories, but about Indigenous territories. So all these different ways that there can be a connection there that brings this into the realm of Indigenous data. Okay, turn back over to you, Mikey.
Thank you very much, Lee. One thing I failed to mention in the introduction, and I'll let everybody know this now, that on the GNU YouTube page, there is a full recording of it's coming, sorry. There will be a full recording of the events that took place at the first meeting. So if anybody wants to get caught up and kind of go back and watch that with some of the discussions that were had there, that will be made available as soon as possible. One of the things that is coming up within the discussion, I think, is a good transition into our next presentation in regards to CARE and OCAP principles. It is something that Mr. John McCare is going to be going through at length. Again, in the first workshop, we kind of just touched the surface of CARE and OCAP and what they are. And John is going to be giving us a more in-depth presentation. And throughout the day, we'll be talking more about, how that, the application of CARE and OCAP can actually address the question that you would put forward, Sky. Kind of, these are possible solutions that we can go through. I know that Lee did give an opportunity to ask questions, but if there is at any time any questions that come up during the day, he will be here. So if you want to just ask, that's all right too. Anybody online, same thing. So moving forward, we'll have John here to give a presentation on CARE and OCAP principles. That's it. Thank you, Mikey. Willie exit bugum sirwan, dalawi si John Mervyn Vicar, aklis to guts lewi, aklis to guts wiki, we will dasi exit dandesi of Bayday of Kiskuk. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Vicar. I'm from Listuch and Executive Director of GINU. And I'm happy to be here today and happy to see the people here today as well, in person and online. So before we get into OCAP and CARE principles, I just want to quickly revisit the definition of Indigenous data sovereignty. In the first workshop, we kind of looked at a few different definitions. And to recap, simply put, Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. This ensures that data is managed in a way that respects their culture, values, and traditions. It empowers Indigenous communities to make decisions about their own information, to protect their knowledge, and support self-governance and self-determination. Essentially, it's about giving Indigenous communities the power to handle their own data, just like they would handle their own land and resources. And so there's two frameworks that we're going to be looking at that would help support self-determination and Indigenous data sovereignty. The first one is CARE. The CARE principles developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance are an essential framework for guiding the management and use of Indigenous data. These principles stand for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and they emphasize the importance of centering Indigenous rights and interests in data governance. Unlike traditional data management frameworks that often prioritize open access, the CARE principles recognize that data must be used in ways that are beneficial to Indigenous communities, respecting their authority over their own data and ensuring ethical considerations are always at the forefront. And so in the beginning, the first workshop, we just quickly went over CARE, but to get a little bit more in depth, each letter can be broken down a little bit furthermore. So if we look at for collective benefit, for C1, for inclusive development and innovation, governments and institutions play an important role in supporting the use and reuse of data by Indigenous nations and communities. This support is not just about granting access to data, it's about helping communities and nations establish necessary foundations that allow for Indigenous innovation and value generation. Inclusive development means ensuring that Indigenous communities are empowered to use data in ways that promote local, self-determined development processes. And this might involve creating new opportunities for economic growth, supporting cultural preservation, or addressing community-specific needs. C2, for improved governance and citizen engagement. Data is a powerful tool for enhancing governance and engagement within Indigenous communities. It plays a vital role in planning, implementing, and evaluating policies that directly impact Indigenous peoples. For instance, data can help us understand better the unique needs and challenges within a community, allowing for more tailored and effective policies. The ethical use of data fosters transparency, enabling Indigenous communities to have a clearer understanding of their peoples, territories, and resources. Data can also provide insights into third-party policies and programs, ensuring that Indigenous peoples are not left out of critical conversations and decisions that impact them. The next one, C3, for equitable outcomes. When we talk about equitable
outcomes, we're emphasizing that Indigenous data should be rooted in community values. These values extend beyond the community itself and benefit the society at large. Any value created from Indigenous data should be shared in a manner that is fair and equitable, contributing to the well-being of Indigenous communities. Equitable outcomes ensure that Indigenous people see tangible benefits from their data, reinforcing their rights and their sovereignty. Authority to control, recognizing rights and interests. Indigenous people hold inherent rights and interests in their Indigenous knowledge and data. It's about recognizing the collective and individual rights of Indigenous people to their information. They have a right to free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to collection and use of their data. Any data gathering must be done with full transparency and agreement from the community. Indigenous people should be involved in the development of data policies and protocols that govern how their data is collected and used. It's about ensuring that Indigenous voices are not only heard, but are central to the decision-making process surrounding their data. Data for governance. Indigenous people have a right to access data that supports their worldviews and empowers their self-determination. Without access to relevant data, Indigenous communities can't fully participate in or influence decisions that impact their lives. Therefore, it's essential that data be made available and accessible to Indigenous nations and communities. Governance of data. In addition to accessing data, Indigenous peoples have a right to develop and implement their own cultural governance protocols concerning their data. This includes being leaders in the stewardship of their data and having authority over how it's accessed and used, particularly in the context of Indigenous knowledge. It's vital that Indigenous people are the ones who define the terms of data governance. Responsibility. For positive relationships, the use of Indigenous data is intrinsically linked to relationships that surround it. These relationships must be built on a foundation of respect, reciprocity, trust, and mutual understanding. Importantly, these values are defined by the Indigenous people to whom the data relate. This means that anyone working with Indigenous data has a responsibility to ensure that their actions, whether it's in the creation, interpretation, or use of the data, upholds the dignity of Indigenous nations and their communities. R2, for expanding capability and capacity. With the use of Indigenous data comes a reciprocal responsibility to enhance the capabilities and capacities within Indigenous communities. This means that we must work towards increasing data literacy and supporting development of an Indigenous data workforce. Additionally, there's a need for robust digital infrastructure that enables creation, collection, management, security, and application of data. It's not enough just to collect it. We need to ensure that Indigenous communities have the tools and knowledge to use it effectively in ways that support their self-determination and governance. R3, for Indigenous languages and worldviews, we must ensure that data generated and used is grounded in Indigenous languages, worldviews, and lived experiences. This goes beyond merely translating data or information, but involves embedding values and principles of Indigenous people into every aspect of the data process. And E, for ethics. For minimizing harm and maximizing benefit. As Indigenous peoples, our data should never be used in ways that harm or stigmatize our cultures, knowledge systems, or communities. Ethical data practices respect our identities and uphold our dignity. This means collecting and using data that aligns with our ethical frameworks and are consistent with the rights affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. When we talk about minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, we're emphasizing that any assessment or potential impacts must come from our perspective, the perspective of the communities to whom the data belong. For justice, justice in data practices means addressing the imbalances in power, resources, and historical injustices that continue to affect Indigenous people today. Ethical processes must confront these imbalances directly and ensure that our rights, both Indigenous and human rights, are respected. This requires that we have representation in all decisions related to our data. Our voices must be at the table, and our perspectives must guide the processes. For future use, when we talk about the future use of data, we must consider the potential impacts on our communities, both positive and negative. Data governance needs to be rooted in ethical frameworks that reflect our values and our principles, ensuring that data continues to serve our communities in the long term. Metadata should clearly outline the origins and purposes of the data, including any limitations or obligations related to its secondary use. Consent is a critical component. Our communities must be fully informed and have the ability to consent to any future use of our data. By thinking ahead, we protect our communities from future harm and ensure that our data remains under our control. So that's a quick recap of the CARE principles. And the other framework that we're looking at is OCAP, which was developed in Canada. So OCAP, which is a registered trademark of the First Nations Information Governance Center, it stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. And it's a fundamental framework for how we as Indigenous people can manage our data. Ownership refers to the relationship of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, and information. This principle states that a community or group owns information collectively in the same way that an individual owns his or her personal information. Through ownership, we assert our sovereignty and ensure that our knowledge remains under our control, guided by our values and traditions. Control affirms that First Nations, their communities, and representative bodies are within their rights in seeking to control over all aspects of research and information management processes that impact them. First Nations control of research can include all stages of the research project from start to finish. The principle extends to the control of resources and review processes, the planning process, management of the information, and so on. It's essential that we are not just participants, but decision makers at every stage. By exercising control, we safeguard our knowledge and ensure that it's used in ways that truly benefit our communities. Access refers to the fact that First Nations must have access to their information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held. The principle of access also refers to the right of First Nations communities and organizations to manage and make decisions regarding access to their collective information. This may be achieved in practice through standardized formal protocols. While ownership identifies the relationship between a people and their information in principle, possession or stewardship is more concrete. It refers to the physical control of data. Possession is the mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. It is the mechanism that allows us to safeguard our information and ensure it remains within our control, reinforcing our sovereignty over our knowledge. And to conclude, as we've seen, both OCAP and CARE principles are not just abstract ideas. They are powerful tools that help us protect our knowledge, our culture, and our future. By embracing these principles, we are asserting our rights, our responsibilities, and our sovereignty over the data that reflects who we are as Indigenous people. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you very much, John. We are going to go into another presentation right now, but for the time being and while the presentation is taking place, I'd like each and every one of you, if you could, to really think about some of the things that John was talking about, because it will get into our discussion question. So I'd like everybody to just kind of play with the thoughts in their head and talk about or think about what we could do and how these two principles can help support us in what we're the direction we want to go and what we want to do. So moving forward, we will ask Carol Ann to come up and give a presentation for a GNU example of data management experience.
Do you see it in full view on Zoom and everything? Okay. Okay. Willie Exigbu, Diluizi Caroland, Lewi Mataweg, Wigi Gameg. I work as the research director for GINU. And I'll present as a Western trained scientist and non-Indigenous person how I've unlearned things, I guess, and recognize bias and power dynamics and how we continue to assimilate data and continue to marginalize people as scientists. Yeah, I am non-Indigenous, non-Mi'kmaq. I have been working in research in Gespe'gewa'gi since 2006, and I also grew up in Matapedia, and so yeah. Cool. There's a lot of research that involves Indigenous knowledge and more, and over time in science, we're seeing a greater inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. We've seen it mostly in ecology. It's a field that has been in environmental sciences that has been more inclusive than others to include Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous peoples are not always included though in those publications. So even though there's been an increase in the number of publications, it doesn't necessarily translate in an increase in participation in actual research outputs and inclusion from scientists to include Indigenous authors and scholars. In the concept of two-eyed seeing, it's a very similar comparison where Indigenous knowledge is very focused on place-based observations over time, natural experiments, its continued observation over millennia, long histories and deep time knowledge and references to baselines. It's often qualitative, but in Western science would emphasize more global observations, experimental design, project-related, short-term projects, often short-term funding, short-term graduate students, short-term graduate projects. Reference to recent baselines and quantitative measures. There's still in ecology a lot of commonalities within those. It's observation of ecosystems and relationships between those components. They share complementary conceptual themes. The knowledge comes from different sources, but the knowledge that is produced is comparable and complement one another. Traditional ecological knowledge is now formally recognized as a legitimate source of information in wildlife management legislation at the federal level from the Government of Canada. For example, species at risk. Indigenous knowledge is rarely used in the context of impact assessments, and especially not in management decision-making. Often researchers will cherry pick the information that fits the current Western science narrative to complement the decision that they were already going to make. So that's a bias that they have to check. Two-eyed seeing is a concept that was created by Elder Albert Marshall and his late wife, Merdina. It's a Mi'kmaq framework for braiding diverse knowledge systems that encourages us to see from one eye with the best of Indigenous ways of knowing and from the other with the best in the mainstream or the Western ways of knowing. And most importantly, learning to see with both eyes together for the benefit of all. And so for the benefit of all being Umset Nogama. So being all the relationships and the entities in the ecosystems. There's the coexistence of two distinct knowledge systems, and often in two-eyed seeing projects, we have to be careful as Western trained scientists to not do knowledge assimilation. So the status quo is the mainstream. It's the figure on the left. We have Western science with one perspective, and they publish papers, and then decision-making happens based on the best available science, and that's what happens. Then we have Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous data that is included in a Western process or in a species at risk review or status, and it's incorporated, and then it becomes assimilated. And then the Western researchers continue to publish their work, and then decision makers continue to marginalize Indigenous peoples because Indigenous peoples are not at the table interpreting the information. Knowledge coexistence is that there's equal footing, there's equal perspectives, there's equal value in both Indigenous knowledge and Western science. They're both seen as legitimate, complementary, and then throughout the system of research process, you see that they're parallel. They're following each other, they're side by side, they're distinct, and they're not assimilated by one another. And then at the decision space, Indigenous peoples with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous data participate in the decision-making. And so everybody retains their perspective and their knowledge base, but then we come together in a space where it's an ethical space for decision-making and valuing knowledge. So Western science has a systemic tendency to extract knowledge from Indigenous communities rather than collaboratively build new understanding. It's often not something that researchers perceive or realize that they're doing, but they are. There's the risk of mobilizing Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous data. So in an effort to make the complex more easy to understand, local knowledge can be at risk of being separated from local context. So if Indigenous data was shared into a database, and then there's this information about territories or fish species or a species that's found throughout Canada, but then that data is used to be modeled or analyzed without the local context or the very specific place-based nuances. Well, that's cherry picking. We can't just have a big database of Canada-wide Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous data and then make decisions without Indigenous peoples at the table. So we have to avoid cherry picking because we can't transform that knowledge or that information that's been shared, and it's not a currency. So it's not something that just can be utilized. Indigenous knowledge is often seen only as relevant if it fits or complements the Western scientist narrative perspective. There's this new paper that comes out of a workshop on Indigenous data sovereignty. It's by Sarah Cannon and many more collaborators, where it's about taking care of knowledge and taking care of salmon towards Indigenous data sovereignty in an era of climate change and cumulative effects. It's very interesting. It comes from the West Coast, very applicable to the East Coast. And so the caution that they state is applying Indigenous data outside of its people's place, for instance, by aggregating Indigenous data into large data sets, means that such nuanced context is lost. While non-Indigenous researchers may have good intentions by collecting and seeking to make use of Indigenous data and valuing it, they have created a need for Indigenous data governance to apply to external parties. So even though we're doing Indigenous data governance within community, within territory, well, now that Indigenous data governance applies to DFO, to universities, to companies, to anybody outside that uses Indigenous data or Indigenous knowledge. So there's this other paper by House et al. It's on participatory fisheries. It's a great graph because I think we can see where we can catch ourselves, and it's a great, for Western scientists anyways, every time you have a project, you can be like, well, which square am I in? Am I in the top left, the top right, bottom left, bottom right? So if we start on the top left, it's participation in other aspects of fisheries management may be empowering, but Indigenous and local knowledge is dismissed. So say we have salmon management, DFO wants us to do some salmon management, kind of participating in it, but they're not incorporating or valuing the Indigenous knowledge. So they're somewhat empowering communities, but then they're oppressing the knowledge portion of it. Then if we go bottom left, management only accepts Western science, stock assessments only are of value, and people are excluded from decision-making. So determining lower reference points for stocks and fish removal, for example, and not valuing either knowledge or peoples at the decision-making table. Well, we're both marginalizing communities and we're also oppressing their knowledge. We go bottom right, we have Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge is extracted, but people cannot participate in decision-making. So knowledge is somewhat valued, it's coexisting, but we're still marginalizing people because they're not involved in the decision-making. And then there's the center part where it's called assimilating knowledge. It's where participatory monitoring involves people collecting data using Western scientific methods. So say GINU is collecting fish sample, parasites data, water chemistry, drone mapping. All that data is captured with Western methods, technologies, remote sensing. But then we're sharing that knowledge or we're mobilizing that knowledge, but then it doesn't translate into a greater decision-making power, or we can't actually use that data for informing decisions. Well, it's the entities and the power structures simply assimilating the knowledge. So where we want to be is in the top right corner, where participatory governance is grounded in Indigenous and local knowledge and Western science. So there's a knowledge coexistence, but also empowerment of communities to actually participate and inform decision-making. I'm ending this talk with a quote from Elder Medina Marshall. Traditional knowledge was never meant to be static and stay in the past. Rather, we must bring it into the present so that everything becomes meaningful in our lives and communities.
Thank you very much, Carol Ann. So we're a little, well, we're actually right on time, which is great. So we're going to go into a little health break right now. But at the same time, we are going to pose an engagement question with you. So on some of the tables, there are Post-its, really big Post-its with some markers. If you guys want to grab a couple pieces, bring them to your table and just have a discussion around the question, write down your ideas, write down things that maybe it poses more questions than it does anything else. So the question is as follows, and I believe that there are agendas at the front with the question written in them, so it'll be beneficial for you guys as well. What is a personal or organizational data management experience you'd like to share? So what are some of the best practices or lessons learned that came out of this experience? So again, if you can answer the question, that'd be great. But if the question itself provokes more questions on your behalf, feel free to write them down. It's all data that's going to be collected. It's all information that's going to be useful for the process. So I would encourage everybody to get up, stretch, go have a donut, maybe a muffin, some coffee, a little bit of fruit, and come back to your tables with your Post-its and your markers, and let's have some good, meaningful discussion. I would also recommend those online. You obviously can't have our stuff, but you can, get up, stretch, and make yourself a coffee or get something to drink at home, and or at your office, wherever you may be. So we'll be doing that up until about quarter after. So around 11:15, we'll come back and we'll have that discussion. Thank you. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you very much for sticking around with us. For those of you who are online, welcome back. So moving forward, we are going to have our overall discussion about the engagement question. For those who came in a little late, the engagement question was, what is a personal or organizational data management experience that you would like to share? Or what are some of the best practices or lessons learned that came out of this experience? So what I'm going to ask everybody to do, if you can, let's get up and let's get mobile. If we can actually form a circle, let's try to do it in the middle of the room. So if we can move our seats, so we can have one general discussion. So that way we can utilize one set of microphones to collect everybody's information all at once. So if we could either gather around one table or if we could kind of get central around one microphone, that would be fantastic. Okay, so everybody who had a chance to either have discussions about the engagement question or write anything down, now's the time to, put things forward. Do I have a volunteer from anybody who's here to actually go first? So we can get it moving and then we will move clockwise from that. Also, for those of you who are online, our moderator will maintain your questions and make sure that they get presented or statements that you make and so on. So, since we don't have any volunteers, I will go with Lee since he is. Oh, Scott? Okay, sorry, I didn't see, sorry, Uncle, I didn't mean it, man. So we'll go with, Scott and we'll go clockwise around the room.
I can't remember the year, but it was a long time ago. Anyways, we're working with DFO and we're doing experiments to find out how, why there's so many salmon on the Restorer side as opposed to being on the Campbellton side. This is when the mill was still operating. And we went up river to go get a few salmon and we did about maybe 5 trips. Took one from there, brought them all the way back out to Richardsville. Let them release them over there. They stayed in their bunching side, but the moment they got closer to the wharf, shot over on the correct side. Every one of them. Pinpoint. So my dad said, because the waters are dirty. It was just that simple. It wasn't science, and the waters are dirty because the color of the water was like for sweater, burgundy. So when it passed a certain area within the wharf, the water was clear, but it was always clear on the Quebec side. So that was one of those experiments that they were trying to prove how we were overfishing. And I went backwards on them. What they did with that data, or if they use that data, I don't. But I was there. I seen it happen.
How
And that's
ironic
okay.
though, ironic though, when I think about that, because here there is other people, the fishermen, and they're fishing in abundance. Whereas First Nation people, this is our way of life. A lot of people might not think that, but as I remember now, I'm gonna reveal my age, I'm 67. And I can recall everybody used to fish. And they wouldn't be like fishing until they're gonna sell it, they were sharing it. They were cooking it for the family. I mean, it was something that was shareable. It was a time like powwow. It was time to get together. It wasn't about prizes. It wasn't about becoming rich. And I think about that today. And there is some, I want him to say a quote, because I can't remember exactly what your grandfather said. Would you repeat it again? Yeah. The way we live, it comes from the woods and it comes from the water. It has been like that forever. And I'm really surprised he texted me this morning. He said, there's a meeting here today, and I was planning to come anyway. And I think about that. I think about it, and I'm thinking about why is it even like what she's talking about, Carol? I'm even surprised that we haven't reached to the level where DFO, the government, doesn't listen to us. It really, I'm totally blown away. And even if they have research, I mean, thankfully, Carol, people that you have hired, they're doing an awesome job, because I keep looking at Facebook. Maybe I don't understand everything I'm reading, but if I don't understand, I shoot a message to, oh, my name is Lillian, by the way. I shoot a message to her because I don't know what kind of fish that is, and I'm curious. But it's really surprising how we just didn't come as far, and I think fishermen should be here too. I don't know where people are. I'm just more shocked. Yeah. I don't know what people think, and when he mentioned about the fishermen want to sue Listicus, and I'm thinking, why? It's not like we're making a whole lot of money fishing and we only have a certain amount of weeks to fish. I just don't get it. I don't get their mentality. either they're ignorant or they think money is gonna make them happy for the rest of their life. Money does not make you happy. It helps, but it sure doesn't. Families, you feed families, you get together. Now that's the most important thing. But anyway, you guys are doing a good job. And we didn't write anything down, just been talking. I'll give you another example. My mom and his grandmother. My grandmother asked her kids, you gotta go to town and you gotta go buy a salmon. Do you think they talked about the whole salmon? No. They talked about the only thing natives could buy was the head. Isn't that a shame? So my mom is on her chair, on her comfy chair, and she's telling me this story. And she says, you know what? She said, as we were walking, she said, how are we going to express to them what we want? What are we going to say? They only spoke the language. So they proceeded to go to town. They had a thought in their head. When we get to town, we're going to tell them we want to buy salmon hats. That's all they had. That's all they could think of. But they couldn't say salmon head, like it's salmon hats. That's what we're going to tell them. We're here to buy that. Because that's all they were entitled to. Now that is a shame with the white government. I'm not trying to disrespect you guys, but I think it's 2024. I think people should listen. Should really consider thinking of what First Nation people say. Because to me, it's a disgrace. I'm appalled. I can't even believe it. I was sitting there listening bad enough. I don't hear well. And I'm thinking, did she say that? Or did he? Yeah, it's like, I need to read that by myself. Because I need that presentation. Because I'm just so surprised. I mean, Western society has put us where we are today. And us trying to bring back the language, well, not working now, but all these years as a teacher, and trying to teach them about the importance of fishing, about hunting, and there's so many elements as First Nation people, getting together, moving about, and we do a lot of sharing with other First Nation people. We actually even have our arms open, non-native. So I wish that you guys would think about this. And I really appreciate listening to me because I could say a little bit more, but I'm not going to. We have Wendell. Wendell, you're next.
No, just going back to what you said and what Scott just mentioned earlier, and they're 100% right. It was about I call it blame. No offense to DFO or no offense to anybody here.
Yes.
We were always to blame. But since 81 and going back to 1992, when we started implementing our own laws, regulations, our own First Nation organization, scientific organizations. And since then, when we started in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, we've always implemented our own rules, regulations. Who best to know about us, how to fish? Nobody from outside sources is going to tell us, either the provincial or federal governments, how to manage our own fisheries. So this is how everything started. This is why we have now, and we have other organizations. We have our organizations within our First Nations. Because data, we didn't have access to data at that time. We had to chase after it. Our own data. We had to rely on DFO data, no, which wasn't accurate at all. For instance, I'll use one. Back in 1999, I questioned the federal negotiator, James McKenzie, I think his name was, at that time in Halifax. I'm going to crab fish at that time. It was, when they cut the quotas, after I think we just started snow crab fishing for 1 year, 2 years, then they started cutting the quota down. But there was a reason behind that. After the First Nations were allowed to start fishing, then they start cutting the quota. But DFO seen that problem 5 years prior to that happening, and they they had a blind eye to it. They didn't do nothing about it till we, the First Nations, started fishing snow crab and other species under the Marshall Agreement back in 1999. So this is what I mean, that the trust isn't there. We have to take it upon our own selves to do our own work. And today, this is where we are today. Our own organizations, our own data, we share amongst us, which is accurate, and the great work that they do. I think Babino has their own scientific too, and we have a global one with Gespe'gewa'gi, Babino, and Ilverbar. So the work continues, and this is first and foremost our living. It's what they do, what we know how to do. And no outside sources is going to tell us how to do it, when to fish and how to fish. Now there's no blame anymore. Like Scott used to say, they used to try to find an excuse to blame us. And 1 year back, we gave up accepting dollars from the province in DFO for a year. And there was salmon fishing. Some of you might remember. We had to prove ourselves. We don't need to in our rivers. We know what we're doing. But back in 1995, Gespe'gewa'gi wins an award for the best managed river after we took over in 1992. It won an award in the North Shore as the best managed salmon fishery in the Gespe'gewa'gi River. I remember so clearly, fishermen from here, and that comes from the province of Quebec, of all things. It won the award for the best managed fish. It just proves we can manage our own without outside resources. We work with outside sources. I could say more, but I want to hear from everybody. I'll leave it at that for now, but everything's going well now. Don't touch anything that's going well. I'll leave it at that.
Personal data management experience, yeah, I had a hard time trying to come up with something, but then I kind of was thinking about, again, on the same topic of fishing. And I kind of just clued in this year, and I've been kind of fishing salmon for a long time, since I was a kid with my dad and grandfather and my uncles, and kind of now for the past few years been fishing with my friends, or one of my friends, but never really realized how much let's say data you're taking in and analyzing on the fly as you're fishing salmon. And a lot of people are humble, and you ask them for knowledge, or that and they'll say, oh well, I I don't know anything, why do you want to talk to me, but let's say when we were going out to fish, we kind of, we data point is, okay, what's the tide at? What's the tide level? So you're thinking about the tide. And then you kind of look at, okay, so what's the wind direction? And then that's another data point you're taking in, the wind direction. And then you're thinking about locations. Okay, where should I set the net this time? I had a good catch here this particular time. Another particular day, it wasn't so good. You're also thinking about the moon cycle. Is there a new moon coming in, or is there which also affects tides, but it also affects fish coming in. So and you're also thinking about, okay, the time of when you are in the season, because at different points of the season, well, there's different things that come in. There's different fish that come. There's jellyfish that come in. There's seaweed that comes in. And so there's just going out there every day. You're taking in all these different data points, and you're analyzing on the fly. And just kind of goes back to, I truly believe our people are born scientists. Whether they realize it or not, they just the connection that they have, with the land and with the wind and, all the elements of nature, we're consuming that and making decisions, depending on what's going on. And it's kind of just clicked this year for some reason. I don't know why, but just kind of thinking about that. We were talking with my friend too about that. You have to take in so much and make those decisions based on just, some people think it's, I'm just putting my boat in the water, I'm going to throw a net in the river and cross my fingers. There'll be something on there. But really, there's a lot of decision making that happens, and analysis that happens on the fly. So just kind of something I wanted to share, or something that kind of, became apparent, I guess, with this year and last year.
I like that.
Yes, another training. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sit. Bill on top.
Oh, I will come back.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm glad that this is going on today. Data sovereignty is something that I started learning about a couple years ago. And I often think about data sovereignty from the perspective of like governance and decision making. So we don't currently have an accurate picture of and I also think about it in terms of people. So we don't have an accurate picture in terms of what our population looks like. So that impacts our ability to make, informed decisions when it comes to how we allocate resources and funding. So I often think about some things that we did a couple of years ago when Canada was updating the census. It was during COVID, and Lissagush as a community, we decided that we were not going to partake in the Canada census. And the decision at the time was partly due to COVID. We didn't want to encourage door-to-door interactions, but at the same time, it came from this data sovereignty perspective where we wanted to implement our own census where we could get a more accurate picture in terms of who we have in the community, and capture certain data points. So the infrastructure for that was never built. But it's cool to see that, those conversations were happening then and that they're continuing to happen now. So when I think about, that personal or organizational data management experience, I see a lot of opportunities now, and how we can kind of help build that infrastructure. And I'm really grateful to be here. Thanks.
So for myself, I guess I'm in a little bit of a different situation, as a employee of the federal government working in DFO. So my experiences with data are also on the side of there may be various projects that I'm working on that require using data sources. And just listening to a lot of the discussion today, hearing about challenges getting access to data. Either the department not making data accessible, or maybe there's a lack of trust in the accuracy of the data. And then thinking about for myself, when I have a lot of ease of access to data that's available to me, it just makes it very clear to me how different the situation is in terms of the privilege that I have to get access to a lot of this data quite easily. So it just, yeah, it makes me think about how important some of these aspects of data sovereignty are, particularly the accessibility of data, but then also the ways in which the data can be used. So if we have different projects that we want to work on to leverage that data, we can put it to use for our own benefits, but then others we may use that data for very important reasons that are local and community face a lot of challenges that aren't present for us. So it's not so much kind of personal uses of data that I'm thinking about, but just the differences, the variance that exist, and how it is really important that we keep having these discussions to figure out how to navigate that and break down some of these barriers. And hopefully build up situations where there can be more trust in data that is being provided. Because I hear it quite clearly that data coming from DFO is not necessarily going to be great. So we need to improve the relationship, the bigger behavior on that. Yeah, so that's what I'd like to share on that. Thank you.
My name is David, and I'm a DFO employee. That's an affirmation from me. I think what I would maybe like to speak to is, it's not data management per se, but we are having a number of conversations on Indigenous data sovereignty. And what we hear sometimes, particularly from, say, resource management, use data, make decisions, is some concerns on what exactly it means for them. Does this mean they won't have access to data? I guess there are two. One is concerns about what that means for the data they need to have. And then the other is, well, what's indigenous about it? That's kind of the flip side. And what we're trying to explain to them is, you know, indigenous data sovereignty is like any other data sovereignty. That are people who own the data, who want to ensure that they can control that data and that's being used for their benefit. And that's it. It's not that the data has some indigenous quality to it. It's about indigenous peoples, and as a result, you know, it needs to be used for their benefits and not cost. And the other thing that we communicated, recognizing indigenous data sovereignty does not necessarily mean that that data is not to be shared, but it needs to be done in a way that's accountable and transparent and with responsibilities for that data. So that if data is being provided to the department and it belongs to an indigenous community, to First Nations, we need to be clear about how we use and protect that data and ensure that it's you know, not going to be shared in a harmful way with others who might use it in ways that it wasn't intended. So it's an ongoing conversation within the department, but I think it really comes down to I think we have a learning job. We have an education job ahead of us. I think that when people really understand what Indigenous native sovereignty means, we'll start to encounter less resistance about it, but it's something that we need to happen.
William Sidwin, WC Village, Fall Riverside West, Lately. And I'm a carbonated water addict. And something I've been that's been on my mind lately is I've heard once before that at First Nations, we're steward of the land and the water. And to say, you know, you see a piece of garbage or an obstruction of the woods, you know, if you're able to pick it up or clean it up yourself, you should do so. You should need a permit from your own territory. And that goes hand in hand with, let's say there was an obstruction in the brook. I think you're supposed to have a permit to remove an obstruction, but if it's to better salmon or trout that have more accessible route, that you're doing your own due diligence as a steward of your own territory. And I think that goes hand in hand with both land and water. And you know, this year in particular, I've been not only on the field for X amount of time for work, but I've been also fishing with these guys a lot. So, you know, I'm still learning a lot myself from a tender age of 27. I still have a lot to learn. Thank you.
I've nothing to talk about. Share this.
27, get to 28, okay?
Yeah.
That's all. You're no rock star.
Yeah.
Only in your own mind, okay? I'm Fletcher Jerome. I'm from here. Lots of great stories from gang here. It did remind me of back in 92 when we did our own watershed management program. And I do remember the discussions, which I was all for. The idea is like, because Quebec was trying to, what do you call that? Blackmail us. You know, you're not going to get to build houses unless you agree to this. And the way I saw it was like, if it's in the budget, they have to spend it. And it's not like they didn't put it in the budget. So I'm like, why do you have to? Anyway, it worked. We said, we'll do it our way. I do remember fishing as a child, like seriously as a child, like 8, 9 years old. And it was scary sometimes. I don't ever remember wearing a life jacket. Anyway, yeah. We've come a long way. We're still here. The salmon's still here. I'll talk about the woods for a second though. When I was a lot younger, I was very idealistic and I really hated the idea of like, man, we're cutting down all of the trees. We need the trees. I do miss, like the older people, I'm gonna ask you to recall how beautiful the hills looked when we were young. They look like art, whereas now it's just a drab yellow. And I miss the pinks, the fuchsias, the vibrancy. But that was because we cut it all down to keep our houses warm. But what I realized, here's my data, they grew back. And they'll always grow back. It's just the idea that you end up with too many in one spot and then you have to go and maintain them and manage them. And that's something that we do, and it's very important. I like what you said, Galit, about how I shouldn't need a permit to make the fishway better. You know, shouldn't get a ticket. I never heard of that before in my life. As a bottle picker all my life to this day, I think it's our job to clean up where others are too ignorant to do that. I know that I spent many rainy days burning brush where loggers left huge piles where it would take so long for anything to grow there again. And a lot of them appreciated it. I took a summer off to collect logs that were just left, that would have probably just went to the ground, and a few bugs. Yeah, we're here. We're not going anywhere. I don't think. And I think this is so important. John, Carol, the rest of you guys that work there, so important. Not a big turnout today, but like you were saying, it'll be on YouTube. It'll be there as long as people, and then they'll see, wow, you guys started as this small. Now look at you. That's just a few years down the road, right? But the idea is that we got to do it in order to have our data sovereignty. We got to go and get our data. And thanks to the workers that are doing that. Thanks. It's full circle. Scott said it.
Round two.
Online, there was a comment made in northern Saskatchewan, the knowledge keepers and land users trained, experienced, and trusted with information such as when it is appropriate to use medicines. Often this is because some plants and medicines cannot or can be toxic if not harvested correctly or at the appropriate time. So it's all that information that's used over, you know, millennia, or that knowledge that's been passed down and communicated to keepers, and how when to use the land and the plants and the waters.
So thank you, everybody, for taking part in our talking circle and our general discussion about the proposed question. We are currently 11:54, and as you can see, lunch is here. So we will be taking a lunch break, and then we will come back at around 1 to go through additional presentations and additional information. So everybody enjoy the lunch. Please continue to have discussions throughout the time that you're here through lunch. If there's any questions, deeply, we'll be more than happy to oblige in some discussion with anybody who wants to, have some productive discussion with them. And the GNU staff are also here for any additional conversations as well. So thank you everybody for tuning in for the morning. Thank you everybody here for participating, and we hope you enjoy lunch.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody enjoyed their lunch. I hope all of you online had a good lunch as well to get ready for the second half of today's presentation. Just a quick recap of what we discussed already. We went through some CARE and OCAP principles. We had a couple of discussion questions, or had a discussion question that was posed to everybody here, posed to everybody online. We had a recap of what we did yesterday, our last event. So we're going to move into our afternoon agenda, and it is going to start with a presentation from John McCare about concepts and discussions on GIDA, Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Data. So without further ado, we'll have John come up and present his work.
Thank you, Mikey. For those anybody new joining online, as Mikey mentioned, my name is John Mervyn Vicaire, Executive Director of GNU and from Gespe'gewa'gi. And this presentation is going to be talking about the Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Data, an important framework developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So what are Indigenous Peoples' rights in data? As Indigenous people, our relationship with data is unique and powerful. Data isn't just about numbers or information for us. It's about our stories, our knowledge, our lands, and our people. It represents our past, our present, and our future. The concept of Indigenous Peoples' rights in data is about ensuring that we as communities maintain control over the data that is about us and comes from us. And it just isn't about protecting what we know, but also how that knowledge is used, shared, and represented. For too long, data about Indigenous people has been collected, stored, and used without our input or our consent. This has led to misrepresentation, exploitation, and in many cases, harm to our communities. But we know that data, when handled properly, can also be a tool for empowerment, self-determination, and positive change. That's why the Global Indigenous Data Alliance has developed a framework that outlines our rights in data. These rights are not just about ownership, but they're about governance, privacy, and the ability to define our own stories. So this is a poster put together by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And earlier, when talking about OCAP and CARE, I used the word principles. This is a bit of a shift to try and frame it in terms of rights, because as good as principles are, they're not necessarily legally enforceable. But there's a shift towards a rights movement incorporating these as rights, which may provide a basis for legal recognition. So on the left side, we see a section titled Data for Governance. And this is about our right to control our data to support our governance and self-determination. So the right to self-determination gives us the ability to organize and control our data in ways that align with our collective identity. It ensures that we have the power to decide how data is used and how it reflects who we are as people. The right to possess emphasizes our jurisdiction over our data. It's about having control over the way the data moves, how it's queried, and ensuring that we are the ones who decide how the data is handled. The right to use gives us, both as individuals and as communities, the ability to use data for our own purposes. It's about ensuring that the data is a tool for us rather than something that's taken and used against us. The right to consent highlights the importance of our digital autonomy. It means that we have the power to assess risks, accept or reject certain uses of our data, and ensures that our consent is required before any data about us is used. The right to refuse is closely tied to consent. It ensures that we can say no to certain uses of our data if they don't align with our values or pose potential harm to our people. The right to reclaim allows us to reclaim, retain, and preserve data that reflects our identities, cultures, and relationships. It's about ensuring that we can take back control over data that's been misused or taken from us without our permission. On the right side, we have the section titled Governance of Data. So on the left, we have data for governance. On the right, we have governance of data, which focuses on how our data should be managed and used by others. So the right to govern gives us the authority to lead and collaborate in developing protocols and making decisions about data access. Ensures that we are not just subjects of the data, but active participants in its governance. The right to define is about defining our knowledge, how our knowledge is represented in data, and ensures that our ways of knowing and being are accurately reflected and respected in data that's collected about us. The right to privacy protects our collective identities. It ensures that we have the ability to keep certain aspects of our lives private and that our data is not exposed without our consent. The right to know allows us to track how our data is used, who has accessed it, and how it's being reused. It's about transparency and ensuring that we are informed about what's happening with our data. The right to association recognizes the importance of provenance and proper attribution. It ensures that our data is connected to its source and that we receive recognition and respect that comes with it. And the right to benefit. Finally, this ensures that we benefit from the use of our data. And it's about equitable benefit sharing and ensuring that any derivatives of our data are used in ways that bring value back to our communities. Together, these rights form a powerful framework that helps us protect our data, govern its use, and ensures that it serves our communities in meaningful ways. And we've talked a lot about Indigenous data sovereignty, data for governance, governance of data. And I came across an interesting figure also by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and it's this one. And you can see how everything sort of works together. You have the governance of data feeding into data rebuilding, which provides data for governance, which can help nation rebuilding. And you see Indigenous data sovereignty in the center. So I found this really helpful in sort of being able to conceptualize how all these different values and principles and frameworks can work together to help Indigenous data sovereignty and also help nation rebuilding. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We are next going to have Carol Ann come back up and have a conversation about GNU data management examples related to CARE and OCAP principles.
Thank you. Am I in the correct view, John? Or display settings? If I duplicate? Okay. Is that good now? Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline Gillis. I work as a research director at GNU. We're going to get into some examples related to OCAP and how OCAP has been breached or not respected in certain examples. This is a subsample of the examples. We have others, but we won't get into all of them, but at least showcase some of the issues we've come across with trying to assert Indigenous data sovereignty or at least try to govern the way that the data is going to be utilized. So example 1, DFO and unauthorized use of data. DFO staff assisted with capacity development to carry out stock assessments and build local and regional capacity for salmon research. After a 3-year study was completed by the organization, not by DFO, there was a need for building further capacity to analyze the data. So a data set from the 3 years was shared with one DFO employee to then work collaboratively on analyzing this data. Then other DFO employees utilized that stored data on a computer from that employee that was also uploaded to a server within the DFO framework. Then that data was utilized without our knowledge or consent. And then DFO prepared a technical report that included their data, but also all of our data without us knowing. And then DFO attempted to exclude us from co-authorship. And this issue took 5 years to resolve. There was clear violation of OCAP principles. First, the data was used without consent. The data was used without our knowledge. It was basically stolen and utilized for internal, reporting. And so we had lack of control, ownership of the data. The impact of that undermined the trust between the organization and the DFO office, and a full reluctance to share future data sets or to collaborate with this group. So that's quite a big example. Another one with DFO and data sharing agreement, not having, that experience of not being, respected in the sense what we shared the data initially. Well, now we're like, well, let's try to do this in a better way. We still want to work in a good faith together. So let's start with a data sharing agreement. We were told that data sharing agreements were unfriendly by DFO staff. So this was concerning. So we moved forward with co-developing a research question and the study design. GNU carried out all the field work with GNU equipment. DFO refused to sign a data sharing agreement because they were appalled at the requests where we were trying to assert how the data was going to be utilized and how we were going to maintain OCAP throughout that process in good faith, even though we should have learned our lesson the first time. We provided the data and pursued the collaborative authorship on that. To this day, there's still no data sharing agreement signed on this project. The project has been paused, but the goal is to then co-produce a publication on this research, but we're not there yet. Violations of OCAP, again, lack of control and ownership of the data, because that ownership is not recognized. They're not participating in a co-governance model for that data and how it's going to be utilized. So again, it undermines the trust, and we're reluctant to share any future data or even collaborate with DFO. It's not only the federal departments, it's also provincial departments that have an issue actually signing data sharing agreements with Indigenous organizations. Although if we would request a data set from the Quebec government or from the federal government, we would have to sign a data sharing agreement. So I don't know if it's a fear of losing power that they refuse to sign these data sharing agreements. So in this example, GINU used provincial government open data online. GINU modeled data and generated new GIS layers and created new maps. MFFP refused to sign a data sharing agreement because, once again, they were appalled at how our principles of OCAP were overbearing and overreaching. To this day, no agreement has been reached. Violation of OCAP, lack of control again, and ownership of data. The GITA rights are not recognized. They don't recognize our right to govern our own data, to define how the data is going to be utilized. And they also don't respect our right to refuse, because we refuse to share the data set with them. And so that impact then caused marginalization of our organization as being uncollaborative, as being not open, as utilizing open source data for decision-making, but then not being able to give the data to government. But they wanted to decide how the data was going to be utilized, and they wanted to prioritize restoration sites, and they wanted, but they didn't want us to sit at that table. So we refused to share the data. So attempts were made to discredit GINU. University collaborations. In this example, we prioritized the sites for the student to work in. We provided assistance with protocol and data sharing. We shared our data to inform how their sites could be better chosen. The student quit their program following the field season and after they've done all the field work, but then they never provided us a copy of the data. So OCAP violation, loss of control, access, and possession of the data. So even though we've attempted to recuperate that information, we were never able to. The student went MIA, and even though we've reached out personally to that student, we still don't have that data. So the impact is data loss. We have to redo that field work. We have to gather that knowledge again. It's interruption of research, and of course it's a breach of trust, not only with the student, but also with the university that supervised that student. So that gives us, we should have a process where if students come in to extract data from the watershed or from the land or from the waters, that there's raw data copies taken before they can even leave the territory. Another example of a university collaboration, we shared existing data set to a student, but the university refused to sign a data sharing agreement with GINU, maintaining that the students need protection for intellectual property, but in turn refusing to recognize GINU's own intellectual property. So the OCAP violation here is that we have a loss of control, ownership, and possession of the data. So once we share that data with the student at the university, they claim intellectual property on it and on the results. The university maintains that this is needed for the student to actually graduate, which is untrue. So the impact, again, is a loss of trust, delays in research because we delay in sharing this data set and the student has very strict timelines, loss of rights to the co-produced outputs of the research. So there's been a lot of lessons learned, and this is a subsample of the examples or the situations that we've encountered in the research that we've been conducting. It's very important to have data sharing agreements, even though they're perceived as unfriendly. If we set the table at the beginning on how this research collaborative is going to work and what the expectations are for both parties or 3 parties, or if there's more, you know, we have to have that clearly stated out. Then there's nobody that's upset near the end, because it was clear from the beginning how the data was going to be shared, stored, how the research outputs were going to be shared with community. Everything's set in stone at the beginning. There's various institutional barriers to uphold the GITA rights. Universities thinking that if we have rights, the student doesn't have rights. Government thinking that if they release a little bit of power, they'll lose all their power. Widespread misunderstanding of what Indigenous data is. And Indigenous data, as John said a while ago, is everything. Is any data that's gathered by whoever on traditional territory. And in this context, it's Gespe'gewa'gi. So any data that's being collected, DFOs out there electrofishing right now, that's Indigenous data, you know? So there's a widespread misunderstanding of what that is. And there's a widespread misunderstanding of what OCAP principles are. We had discussions with DFO staff who had taken the OCAP training and said that they understood OCAP, but then still refused to sign our data sharing agreements in that sense. So do you really understand the OCAP that you took the course on? I don't think so. Epistemic racism is rampant. That's really looking at how Indigenous knowledge is probably less valued than a Western stock assessment. So they don't value it. They don't see it as equal footing. So right then and there, just the fact that it's Indigenous organization or Indigenous led, there's this bias from scientists that say that it's lesser. It's not as valid. And that comes from that. Knowledge co-productions means different things to different parties. A lot of people don't understand what co-production is. And in our perspective is that co-production happens at every step of the research project or the collaboration. So it's site selection, methodologies, ethics. How are you going to come on the land? When are you going to come? What data are you going to extract? What are your protocols? How are you going to involve us in the fieldwork and the data collection? How will you involve us in the results and interpretation of that data? And what are going to be the research outputs? How we're going to work on that together throughout the whole process. Institutions fail to recognize power dynamics. DFO doesn't realize that, or don't want to admit that, you know, they're the regulator. They don't want to release that power, but at the same time, they don't want to say that they're the almighty, but they're acting as if they are. Same thing for Quebec provincial government. They don't recognize that we can have shared power and it doesn't reduce theirs. Some parties intentionally want to extract data to carry out their own decision-making or publishing without including the organization who produced the data. Like some people are clear. Sometimes I wonder if it's better to just understand that somebody is like, that's their intentions from day one, to completely exclude us instead of pretending that they're gonna involve us and then learn at the end that we weren't even real collaborators. So moving forward, we have to persist in upholding the principles of OCAP for IDS. We have to enforce GNU's tenets and collaborative projects. We have to develop and enforce clear collaborative roles and data sharing agreements early. We have to discuss those expectations early, co-authorships, future use of the data, how is it going to be shared with community. We have to educate partners on OCAP principles and Indigenous data sovereignty, which is also a burden on organizations. Foster trust and transparency in all data-related collaborations. Implement data safeguarding mechanisms between parties. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Caroline. something that I do want to mention during our conversations as well is that this issue is something that is across the board. This is happening in health, this is happening in social services, this is happening in housing, in any department that you can think of or any organization that you can think of, this is happening. So it's not necessarily just the examples given. The examples given are based on the extensive knowledge of the organization that's hosting. So for those, again, online, for those here, this is across the board for a lot of things. And this is an issue that is being dealt with across the country. So we are going to go into an additional health break, but we are going to give another engagement question for those online as well. So the question here is as follows. Where have you seen OCAP or CARE principles successfully applied in data management? And where have you seen barriers in their application or in the realization of Indigenous rights data? So again, if we could have some discussion, we'll take that for about maybe 10 minutes. And then we'll come back together again and we'll form our talking circle, and then we'll express some of the things that have come up during discussion. And that'll be followed up by a brief summary of today's events, where we will finish with a closing prayer. So if we can get into our groups yet again with our post-its, hopefully we write some stuff down this time. And if we can get those conversations going, that would be great. Again, for those who require it, where have you seen OCAP or CARE principles successfully applied in data management? And where have you seen barriers in their application or in the realization of Indigenous rights in data? Thank you very much. All right, everybody. Thank you for engaging in discussion. Similar to the last time we had our group discussion, if we can all move into a talking circle so we can express some of the results of our discussions, that would be great. So we'll start that in about 3 minutes. So if everybody can move in, that'd be great.
Okay.
So for discussion, we'll do the same thing that we did last time. We'll get a volunteer at some point and go counterclockwise again. So do we have a volunteer to go first? Next thing they answer, don't count.
So you need them.
That's me.
Done now.
I'd like to maybe kick it off. And again, it's, I think, I mean, in listening to the presentations in particular, those really challenging, fortunate examples. You know, one thing that is being recognized within the government of Canada, DFO in particular, is the importance of data sharing agreements. I think that, you know, some of those examples, if ESA's data sharing agreements have been in place and there was a shared understanding of responsibilities, in particular, if they had been um, responsibilities and expectations around principles of OCAP and care have been included in those ESAs. I would hope that a lot of or some of the issues might have been avoided. I do think that there is an interest from an institutional level. There is a commitment in the government of Canada to respect Indigenous data sovereignty, to recognize DSAs as an appropriate tool for, expressing and coming to an agreement on how data can and cannot be used to ensure that it does meet the interests of all Indigenous peoples and First Nations communities. But what we see, at institutional level doesn't always get down to the working or operational level. So I think that's something that we need to work on. Hopefully get to that common shared understanding of, these are appropriate tools. They're not, I think the term was unfair. Was that?
Unfriendly.
Unfriendly. They're not unfriendly. And in fact, they're a common tool that the department uses with universities, other organizations. So it should not in any case be considered unfriendly, which especially from a nation to nation. Thank you.
In terms of barriers for care and OCAP, there's a lot that I think are coming up through the discussion already, a lot that we've heard about today. A lot of them I think are based around challenges and just properly understanding what Indigenous data sovereignty is, and it's important. So I think for a lot of employees within the government, just understanding what Indigenous data is or what we do Indigenous data, what we need to be thinking about how we respect data sovereignty is a really big barrier, because some people might be working with data and they think this doesn't really count as Indigenous data for one reason or another, so we don't need to worry about having discussions around what is a respectable way to use this and what should we be doing with this or should we not be doing with this. So I think just getting a lot more education out for government workers to understand that is an important part of this. And also trying to figure out the way to move from the theoretical side, looking at all these principles and understanding this is something that's important. We can see the value of these principles, but how do we actually put them into practice? That can be a challenge as well, figuring out what are the concrete steps we need to do to actually make this happen. I think Carol, you kind of given the example around people who have taken OCAP training, but then they still clearly didn't understand the importance of having data sharing agreement. So they might have understood some things on the theoretical level, but when it came to actually putting that in practice, there's this disconnect. Here's what you've learned, but now what are we actually going to do with this? So I think that's a really big barrier as well. Things like the Access to Information Act, that's a huge barrier in just the control over access to data. So thinking about the access component of OCAP or the authority control there. Also the interpretation of Indigenous data being grounded in world views and in lived experiences, I think is something that's a barrier for being able to respect the care principles as well. So that's part of, I think it's under responsibility, the care principles. So we may often have Indigenous data that we're working with, but we don't have that comprehension, that type of interpretation that's grounded in actual lived experiences. So because of that, we may not be using the data or understanding it. And even just having the ability to provide alternate representation data, have maybe metadata or descriptions that are in an Indigenous language rather than written in English. So anyway, lots of different barriers that I'm thinking about that. Part of the question was also on positive examples where things have been implemented well. So one thing that I've seen within DFO is the Salish Sea interactive map, that map with a lot of different geospatial layers of information for marine spatial planning, erosion planning, and ecological information. And it was designed, it was co-developed with 33 First Nations. And it was done in a way that was trying to respect principles as much as possible. So I think there were some good practices that went into that in terms of making sure that every single community had control over who has access to their data and how it's being accessed. There was, all the data was being stored on government servers, so it was not actually subject to the Access to Information Act, so there was a lot more control over how the data was being stored and how it was being used and accessed. So I think it is possible to find positive ways like this to approach things, but it's definitely still something where there's a lot more examples of the bad than of the good, so we need to keep that direction. Thanks.
Something I had in mind, maybe not on the same topic. For to say, but whenever we work with DFO, Hedgehog regulating electrofishing, habitat restoration. We also get to hang out afterwards, chalets and as well, big mowers. And then they're wondering why this river is that name. Has to do with the formation of the river and the characteristics. That's how it gets the same. So that's a fun little thing that we, they're coming there, getting the understanding of where we come from. Language, so I think that helps as well. And actually spending time with us instead of just trying to collect data in an hour or something, actually spending time with. I think that helps. And it creates a big relationship. I go at that.
Come on, little.
You can.
Now you have something to say?
I showed up late, so I didn't get the full discussion, so.
What about the young generation?
Your initial thoughts.
Just something simple. We'd like to see or what you see in the outcome. Fishers related.
Curious about anything?
Anything. There you go. Good.
Is it me?
Yeah.
All right, I came late too. I didn't realize this was happening till I was walking the dog and so
Finally decided.
I popped in. This is actually kind of interesting to me. Starting a master's, I work for a business corp that's dealing with the 3 communities. So it's kind of seeing how important this work is. Seeing as though like we purchase businesses, we build things on the territory. So in my work, I'll be dealing a lot with environmental assessments and things like that. And I think kind of seeing how important this is kind of it's making me think how I need to look more into it. And kind of also when I start my studies, this will be something that I'll be, I guess, studying and looking into. Seeing as important, I think you guys would be good people to talk to while I'm doing that studies. Yeah.
You could study them today.
Yeah, I could, if it's okay with you guys, if I could come to you guys for some information. Yeah, so.
Okay, go on. Like I said, this morning, what we talked about, it's about trust, it's about, our own organizations trusting each other. Information data that. I just don't want to repeat what I said this morning, but we're going forward. That's the main thing. It's going forward and thinking other, especially the resources that we have here in Lisbon right now, like I mentioned earlier. A lot of resources we started off back in the 90s and implementing our own rules, law, regulations, and it's the same thing. Well, moving forward and we're there already. This is there already in lawmaking. There's others related to fisheries in lawmaking. We made 2 historical laws over here too. Based on, there was one of them was back in the 90s, like I said earlier, was in salmon fishing, and back in 2019, 2019 around there, I think it was, when we first implemented 2 the lobster management plan, which was picked up by other First Nations. That's what I mean. We make the laws. We follow our own laws. We don't need to follow the well, we don't know offense, but you know that. Well, that's not experience related. But certainly it's very informative. It's nice to hear from all sides. It's a working process. We still got a long road ahead. We're still on that road, but it takes time to get to the end of the road. But working together, that's the only way we can achieve the goals that we want. We've been doing that, and we're going to continue doing achieving the goals that we have in lawmaking. It takes a while. It doesn't take overnight. It takes years to start implementing your own laws and regulations. It just doesn't take overnight. I'm just going to leave it at that. I could go on and on. John.
Yeah, I was actually having a hard time trying to think of a positive example. Because I think we have more negative experiences trying to implement OCAP principles. But then I realized that we actually did successfully enter into a data sharing agreement with the university, and the data sharing agreement was actually, it was based, like the OCAP principles were embedded within the data sharing agreement. And so, yeah, I think that's why it was with the university, and the professor was Indigenous. And I think that's why I had such a hard time thinking about it, because it was just non-eventful. It seemed non-eventful. We provided a data sharing agreement, and then shortly afterwards, we signed it and gave it back. It was like, okay, yeah, here you go. There was no friction. There was no resistance to it, and I think that's why it kind of slipped my mind that yes, we did actually have a positive experience. So, yeah, and it was with UNB. So I'll throw that out there. They actually, it was. I don't even think they requested any revisions. They just said, yeah, sure, that works. So that was quite refreshing. To just, yeah, and there's a simple process when it actually works. Yeah.
So I'm a part of a research project with the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. So it's a partnership between the Center of First Nations Governance and Carleton University. So in that process, like that's an area where I've seen like a good collaboration that took where OCAP and like the care principles have really been at like the forefront of like what that relationship building aspect in like like research design and data sharing and all that related to the project. So that was like a successful example. John and I were talking earlier about how it'd be really cool to see like a ethics watch board like in our territory, and like what that could look like in terms of like research happening in our nation. And there's existing ones already, like there's the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch at CBU. Yeah, so I was kind of thinking about those. When it comes to barriers in the application or realization of Indigenous rights and data, I think like, again, it comes back to like that understanding. It's like we don't have a common understanding of what these terms mean. And I think like the OCAP training does provide somewhat of like a baseline framework where we can engage in that conversation. With like the way that they did the new training with like the data stewards and like the data, I forget what the other one was now, but I like the new updated version of the OCAP training. Yeah, but overall, I think everybody had some really great things to say, and I'm happy to be here today. So thank you.
You have anything to say here?
No, I think, yeah, and John brought a good example up of collaborations that did work. You know, we brought a lot of examples of things that did not work. But yeah, we do have good, meaningful collaborations with universities and with students. And I think that's just, like John said, it's because the scholar is Indigenous and it's going extremely well. In other collaborations with different entities, there's always a moment where we feel like we've been failed, or maybe we didn't communicate the right way that they could understand where we're coming from in the sense of the research design or how we think that data should be safeguarded, or like if we had an ethics watch locally, you know, up north, there's the saying, nothing about us without us. And like, so researchers that go up north, they don't only have to do a permit to sample fish through the Quebec government, but they also have to submit a request to this ethics board that's governed by the local people that decide, well, that's not a valid research question for us. Why don't you look at this question instead? Or no, we'll not allow you to enter the territory to gather data about this. You know, there hasn't been good, meaningful conversations before to rationalize that. And so can we see something like that in the southern part, you know, on the eastern side where contact has been much longer, and systems are maybe harder to break down. Maybe that's why we're seeing all these Western examples being so fantastic. And then we're always looking to the West to be like, oh, look at this great example of the Salish Sea interactive marine spatial planning. We're here on the East Coast, we're struggling with the marine spatial planning because we have to do this IDS stuff first. So anyway.
So again, thank you, Carol. Thank you, everybody, for taking part, providing your feedback. Anybody who did mark down on Post-its, it will be collected by Kindle for their purposes. So that brings us to the end of the day. I'm going to give just a brief overview of some of the things that we discussed. So we went through, again, care and OCAP principles. We talked about how care and OCAP principles could be beneficial use to all parties involved. We spoke about, you know, where we like to see, or where we'd like to go. We talked about, you know, some of the unfortunate horror stories and the realities that are being lived by different entities. We did mention that, again, this is happening across the board, not just with Depot, it's in just about every department you think of. Again, we had more discussion about care and OCAP, and again, each discussion is moving us closer and closer to at least an idea of where we'd like to go with this process. It's led to other discussions that maybe this is a conversation that we have more of. We do it more often with different groups of people, so on and so forth. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming again, taking time out of your day to come in and take part. Even those who came late, you still have something that you would contribute during discussions and so on and so forth. Again, similar to the last engagement session that we did, I'm sure this one, it will be available online as well. So if there's anything you guys want to go back and rewatch, or if you want to rewatch this one, it's going to be made available to you believe it will be on his YouTube page. So without further ado, I will ask Roseanne Martin to come up and give us the closing breath.
Is it working?
Sorry about that.
Okay. As I was saying, I should have stuck around because it seemed to be such an interesting conversation and all that. I was holding my sweetgrass, sitting there. You guys are talking about the past, the present, moving forward and all that. And I looked at my greatest sweetgrass. There's 3 strands on here that represents the past, present, and future. So without further ado, I'm so grateful to be able to do the opening and closing for these occasions and all that. So thank you from the gift for the gift of life, for allowing me another day on Turtle Island, and for allowing me to be able to do these opening and closing ceremonies within my community. Now, as I think back in the past, I look back at 30 years ago. I didn't speak my language at all. I spoke French and English. And it took a lot of determination on my part to recapture our language back, because we're at the point right now where a lot of us the younger generation is losing it. And so I'm grateful that I was able to retrieve it back. So wala liyo. Kisol ukchinis kamnin dalwazi Roseanne, Gespe'gewa'gi nani nanwas naman nawe na musikas ko dawa siya bag it was. Wala nis kami nung chimi machawakan. Wala ning dandali an kuya win dandali bokon mo. Dandal ke kanang win aktan nalika jig mi machwin udezi kas kakanta tiyo. Pakais nin dalaway. Mamsad ko kay kayo, pem ginama si Yaknin. Wala li actually na. Musigis, naku set ko lakwes, nagumizin and dep kunset. 60 wala li actually, mi machawakan. Wala li actually na. Kijinen makamika, mega damo ni gagis ko dan des gilan ko orban. Ano jo orban ni gagis ko, wala ni michiwakan, wala ni samkan, wala ni meja tip cheese, akwisis cheese. Aktan des gagis like set kamo gilan ko orban, ano jo orban, 60 wala ni actually na. Hit puk chicha kami chuk chibano, wigo up sebe, do widano. Mawidanish, Mawi, Agaludaman, Shankyo, Walalia, Kitabida, Oxapige, Walalia, should know. Sabe with David Epides, every day with Chijakamis, we practice and give them in Nadel and Jordan Nakaka, and Chidin Quachimino. Nabibanis in the Gagis, Kisiabida, Oxapi. Walalim, she done this, Gizikari, and talk to him. Marta wake Wayne at Casno, Tina, Chijakamis, give them in Nadel and Jordan Nakaka, and Chidinamo, Chicken Amino. Walalia, Puchigalo, couldn't piss on Gizikari, and talk to him, Gagis cook, Walalia. Mabeg mo na kadno kimit kinakpem ko pio na ne al joro mo na no gisi ko ma chimo no gisi ko wala ni ge gis ko si tande si gisi ka di min taw tin min anu ako no de makan was school de mi di sigula genu wala le chud na tande so tio no ma do so basically I just sent our ancestors back in the 7 directions and all that and say thank you for each and every direction and all that. Thank you. I'll hope.
So again, thank you everybody for coming out and just letting everybody know that we are having the 3rd engagement session that is going to be August 29th, which is a Thursday here. Same time, 10 o'clock start, and whenever we're done, we're done. So I look forward to seeing you guys at that meeting. For those of you who are on and tuned in, thank you very much, and we hope to see you on the 29th. Thank you.